The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, welcoming you back to Movement 2 of Debussy's La Mer. With this lecture, we're going to cover all of the remaining screens, and so you might think that this would be a really enormous lecture, but it's actually probably going to end up being shorter than you might expect. And that is because the music really comes together, and in that culmination, it's actually easier to explain what's going on, so it might not take as much time. In the previous lecture, we saw that Debussy was kind of playing around with his themes, revisiting some of them, reorchestrating some of them, and now he's going to revisit one of those themes yet again, and this time it's that lovely cello idea, that ba-bum, ba-bum. However, here he's going to treat it to kind of an apotheosis, not merely just a thematic development, but just really taking that theme and turning it into a mighty symphonic gesture. And really, here is where you start to see the symphonic sketch idea come through. This really is symphonic scoring in the sense of creating textures that interrelate and yet all sort of work together towards one particular goal. So let's start with that theme and check out how it works on this first screen here. Notice that Debussy has actually marked out the bowing right in here, and I think that that's pretty unnecessary for you as an orchestrator, okay? I think the main thing that he wanted to tell the players was that it's better to downbow here, even though the slur is pushing into a fairly emphatic crescendo, meaning that the string players might be tempted to start with an upbow. But Debussy wants that really clear, kind of savage push that you get from the downbow right there. And then, of course, it ends up lining up really beautifully for the downbeat of the next bar. Now, you'll see that this is all just really heavily chordal. We have the actual melody itself being played by the upper Debussy firsts and the lower Debussy seconds. Then you've also got that A right here on the bottom of the violas. And then everything else is just filling in the stacked four-part harmony. Speaking of filling in, that's exactly what the winds do here. They basically fill in some pitches between the D sharp and the B, which we see here in the lower Debussy first violins. And all of these other pitches here basically represent the harmonization of the other parts right in here. So you get this really ba-ya, ba-ba-da-da kind of idea. And it really costs almost nothing to Debussy as an orchestrator. He doesn't have to divert other resources that are critical. Now, here, as he really reaches for the sky with this exploration of that cello theme, we have that second theme coming in here, you know, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? But here it's transformed into like a little commentary by flutes and piccolo an octave higher. And it really does add a lot to the thematic texture right in here. As the strings push up, they get a little bit of accompaniment from the English horn right here, starting on a low B and ending up on a high D natural. And that is somewhat following the line of the upper viola in this Debussy in 3 violas. These strings are really heavily divided, aren't they? Last lecture, I discussed a little bit about how it's a little risky when you have chamber strings to get into too much two-part and three-part Debussy, especially when you are trading off with other instruments that might just be stronger as single instruments than each single pitch of Debussy strings. And yet here I feel that Kaleidoscope really does the job. They are actually playing more like mezzo forte than they are like piano right in here. They really are pushing quite a bit. So you can kind of hear that in previous bars, they were holding back probably a little bit more than would be perfect for perfect balance, but in terms of actual feeling of the music, I felt it was very sincere. As the strings push up, we have this wonderful contrary motion here from our oboes and clarinets, basically doubling the same exact pitches as they skip their way down. Let's not forget that in this push right in here, this ba-da-da, we have the horns joining in just for that first bar plus a beat, right? And it really gives a lot of punch to this gesture. And it's absolutely perfect. In fact, Debussy is going to use this a couple more times on the next screen. Meanwhile, we have a little bit of counter melody. Do you remember that little counter melody of the trumpets in the previous screen? It's back again, and it really does provide a nice thematic counterweight. There are several of these, aren't there? There's this little line here, the trumpets in there, the contrary motion from oboes and clarinets, and so on. And pretty much the same thing is repeated again, practically note for note. Something else we should watch out for is this wonderful walking bass here that is being played by cellos, with some help from the harps too, right? We have the harps basically playing these octaves, and this is a great way to score broken octaves in harp, to really just divide it between the two hands in separate staves. That would be the way that I would score it. But notice, it doesn't always have to be two hands. You get to a certain point, and the right hand can just take over. Pretty much, I would say, from this G sharp, it's pretty safe for the right hand to actually play all of the octaves, but Debussy is wise to wait until right here on this D, and it's the easiest of all. Then the left hand can reach over and play this low G sharp right in here. Not that this is adding a huge amount, but every bit helps, right? Now, pizzicato and staccato means that it will be kind of a dry staccato, a very precise, pointy kind of staccato that isn't necessarily sostenuto. Not that it makes a huge amount of difference in terms of the actual duration of the note, but it will make a difference a bit to the articulation of the note, right? There are a bunch of different ways to pluck. And just to say that the string player's index finger plucks the string, it doesn't really quite take into account everything that is going on, especially for a cellist who has a little bit more leeway, a little bit more range of how much nuance that they can get from a particular approach to plucking. But it's really a subtle point, whether or not the pizzicato is going to be as abrupt as it might be. I've heard this section with very generous pizzicato, where the cellists are just playing pizzicato and not really worrying about keeping it abrupt. And then I've heard pizzicato that really is very crisp right in here and doesn't have that sense of fullness that cellos can bring to bear. Here on this next screen, we can see that the whole concept of four-part harmony is really being taken to the hilt here with interlocking sixths. Now, interlocking sixths, I'm not so sure how necessary that really is, except it's probably easier for the players to kind of keep each other in tune. Like the interval of a sixth is very easy to tune by ear when you are kind of sitting inside the music or when you're singing in a choir. So it's probably safer to notate it this way as sixths than as thirds and fourths above and thirds and fourths below. One thing you could say about it is that if this were non-Debussy, it would be a little tricky, but still not too hard to play this as double stops. Sixths are probably the easiest double stop to play. The fingers just sit right in that position. but it's better to play these as individually fingered notes Debussy, really. And then, of course, the violas just continue on with their three-part harmony approach. Here we're getting to this moment in the theme where the arc leaps up here to these diminished chords that just kind of jump back and forth a bit, and then eventually continue on in the same exact vein as before, at least with the strings. With the winds and brass, however, we have got that same support from horns of this first measure plus a beat. That happens here, happens there. And as the strings descend in these triplets, they get some help from clarinets and oboes, basically outlining the beat each time. Notice with mezzo staccato, right? So it's which fills in the harmony without pulling back on the sprightliness of the triplets. And then, of course, as they leap upwards, that leap is reinterpreted in triplets for oboes and clarinets, and then flutes on top. And it really has this wonderful sense of sweep. And these dancing diminished chords are also helped out a little bit right towards the end. Notice that the first two triplets aren't helped, but then the second two triplets are helped out a little bit. And in fact, are bridged over a little bit by these winds during this rest. And then right at the end, once again, the winds provide a bridge and then continue on, skipping back and forth in these harmonic positions as the strings leap up again with measured tremolo. Then here we see a little bit more direct accompaniment of that theme by oboes and clarinets before they once again help out, skipping down, this time joined by the English horn and the flutes above. And then there's that same push upwards in triplets as opposed to tuplets in the strings. So that is the thematic expression of what's going on here. Just really wonderfully symphonic, with everybody just coming together for this final, mighty, triumphant theme. And in Debussy's style, as he sort of laid down before, as I mentioned in the last lecture, in Fête from Nocturnes, he's got that sort of punch from below, that punctuation of the beat in pizzicato from his double basses, along with an arco held note. It was asked recently in the Facebook group, are there any good examples of arco plus pizzicato in double basses? Well, here's a really great one, with lower Debussy basses holding down this long G sharp arco, and then pizzicato on the downbeats with the other Debussy basses. Now here we have both Debussy groups hitting the downbeat. I believe there is a missing dot on this half note right here. So you've got the pizzicato plus the arco, and that actually has this wonderful sound of a very punctuated arco note. It's something you can't really get away with higher strings all that convincingly, but the lower you go, the more effective it is. And actually, the more it simulates the attack and sustain of a low piano note. And that might be something that Debussy was trying to simulate as he was maybe playing this on piano and sort of thinking about the different ideas. Now we have this really cool syncopation right in here. 3 half-note durations across 2 bars of 3/4. And that's played by not only A2 bassoons, but tenor register cellos. And they essentially double this. And then right in here with these diminished chords, they just kind of hang on to the downbeat without syncopating a couple of times, just really giving some ferocity right there in the middle. And then they come back to it right in here. It's a subtle bit of the texture, but it really works great. Then to fill in our understanding of this huge orchestral picture, which is actually not too complicated, is it? We have the horns coming in here and basically playing these diminished chords here. We have D sharp, F sharp, and A, right? Which represent a G-sharp diminished chord. And that is also present in the music, right? We've got the G-sharp of the key signature here, then the B and the D natural, right? So, yeah, it's basically the same exact chord, but down an octave from the violas. What the horns are doing here is kind of timekeeping, right? They're sort of going bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum. It's a bit reminiscent of the bolero rhythm from the beginning of the movement, isn't it? But reinterpreted as a bit of a march rhythm. Then what we've got here is glissando over 2 measures en croissant. So basically the first harpist, who's actually marked as a solo player, right? This is something that Debussy wants the conductor to make sure stands out of the texture. So the glissando is crossing back and forth across the strings in the harp. And I've heard this done a bunch of different ways, from randomly strumming back and forth to very, very calculated to actually having 2 harpists play at the same time and so on. But the harp also does little things like reinforcing the downbeat here and playing beats 2 and 3 and so on. So it's all terrifically exciting, and it is leading to this big crux coming up on the next page here, similar to before when the music was sort of stuck on a G-sharp diminished chord. Here we have something similar going on, G-sharp in the root, but the music is actually playing enharmonically something that equals a B-flat 9 chord, right? So the G-sharp in the bass kind of represents an inverted 7th. Anyhow, not to get into the harmony too much, I don't want this to turn into a harmony lesson. We have that same sense of harmonic ambiguity that we got from the diminished chord in the previous screen. And it just serves as this point of tension where the strings are going back and forth, da 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 da. And it's actually, once again, sort of similar to that bolero rhythm from before, with the winds jumping in from time to time, not playing all the way through. I think that's a very important thing. And right up here, the harp's pretty much right at the limit of what you could hear, right? There's such a strong texture around them that it will be very difficult to hear them unless you're sitting closer to them in the audience. It does contribute for whatever it's worth, but the main element here really is the upper strings plus the winds right in here. And then, of course, this kind of screaming harmony of horns plus bassoons and cellos, just kind of holding down those really firm marcato tenuto chords. So marcato tenuto, what does that mean? So marcato means to sort of hammer or punch the note. And of course tenuto means to have the note be really, really full. So it's kind of like an extra accent on a boxy articulation. And of course, Debussy doesn't even bother marking that for the cellos. He just indicates really strong down bows, and that gives him pretty much what he needs there at fortissimo. Then we got that same sense of pacing with arco plus pizzicato basses. And then everything comes to a big head right here. So ba 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 bum. And instead of throwing in diminuendo, all that Debussy does is he just drops the octave. First for his violins, going from ottava high C and then just no ottava high C, dropping down to high C plus C in the staff. In this case, the violas just stay where they are, doubling the seconds as they drop. And then we keep going down the octaves and so on. And even though there's a kind of telescoping of dynamic power here, it really just has to do with the resonance of the high frequencies, because there's no lessening of intensity dynamically. And the same thing sort of happens at first with the flutes dropping down an octave. But notice that the piccolo just sort of stays in the same place, even though at this point it is outlining what's going on in the first violins at an octave higher. It's just that the first violins are going to absorb the sound of the piccolo, so the piccolo is really just serving to provide resonance right in here rather than a really detectable upper pitch. Even playing fortissimo with accents, the sound of the violins is enough to sort of cushion and absorb the actual sound of the piccolo in there, unless the piccolo player is just kind of going crazy. Notice how the winds going into this fingered tremolo don't actually drop at all. It's really the strings that drop under them. And of course, bassoons and horns, trumpet, all sort of holding down this harmony along with the lower strings. Then we get into this wonderful roiling section in here, which really reminds me of waves kind of dancing and pushing towards each other in little vortices and little isolated areas of splashing and turbulence and so on. This is genius right in here. This staccato, pizzicato, very, very pointy pizzicatos, playing along occasionally with little pitches here and there, right? So doubling these two notes in the violas here, and then these two notes in viola there, these two there in the seconds, and so on, and then little bits and pieces kind of dying away. That reminds me so much of the ocean that I have been a part of, whether it's tide pools or observing from the deck of a boat while sailing or going through turbulent waters and so on. So it's really evocative, beautifully true to the subject which is being dealt with here. And then we've got A2 bassoons in octaves with double basses. It has such a wonderful, chocolatey, rich texture. So let's listen to all of those elements. This kind of roiling, measured tremolo with the little punctuation of pizzicato. The way that the winds right in here maintain their position in the harmony, along with the horns and bassoons and double basses, while the strings work their way down octave by octave, and yet maintaining that sense of triple forte. Listen for how all of this is set up, from this push toward the culmination right here at rehearsal 38, all the way back to this searching development of that melody. The role of the harp right in here, the role of the horns in bringing back some of that bolero-like rhythm, the strengthening of the string parts with touches of winds that aren't constant all the way through, the gradual pacing here of pizzicato plus arco, first pizzicato against long tied G sharps, and then playing together as the music gets even more intense, and then of course the little syncopated notes in cellos and bassoons here and there. All the way back to this intriguing beginning here, which is powerful enough, isn't it? Before you even compare it to the next couple of screens, with this lovely walking bass in the cellos that's somewhat adorned by the duo harps playing broken octaves, and then the little pushes from the winds here and there, the little counter melodies from flutes and from trumpet, and the reinforcing right in here of horns. So listen for all of those things, and then I will rejoin with you after the music for the wonderful apotheosis at the end of this movement. After the extremely vivid tone painting that we just heard, especially that very last section of 4 or 5 bars, Debussy returns to more tone painting, and he revisits this idea of glissando chords in the harps, sweeping up in the first, then answered diminuendo sweeping down on the second. Now, one little point that I wanted you to put in your mental checklist was the concept that the cellos were holding down a B all the way through here. But notice the harmonic motion here with the rooting E in the double basses, and the cello's walking down from D sharp to C sharp to C natural here. Now, during this sweep, we have beautiful soft horns in the background. Third horn plus first and second, just playing this really soft background cushion. A little bit of cymbal. Notice the sort of underuse of the cymbal. You would think cymbal would be all over the place, splashing and swooshing and doing all kinds of very extravagant gestures to remind us that we're out on the ocean. But Debussy just really uses touches here and there, rather than overdoing it. He has the instrument sweep, if anything. Little touch of triangle there. So beautiful, right at the top of these glissandos. Then the middle strings sort of answer, instead of this lovely clarinet here, which is, by the way, setting up the very final bars. Da, 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 da. We have more somber, more uncertain waters down here in the middle strings. Interestingly, Debussy cellos here, right? So the lower Debussy cellos are just going to hold down that low note. A little bit of pizzicato reinforcement from double basses of that C sharp in the cellos. Same thing happening here. You'll notice in the recording that there is a slight goof here from the bassoons. They come in a bar late, and they both come in a bar late, which is probably the result of the second bassoonist watching the first bassoonist and then deciding to go together. But it's not that big of a mistake. All right. Those things kind of happen from time to time in live performances, even with really good players like Kaleidoscope. I like this snarly little note here, the stopped A sharp here and here in first horn, and just that little touch on the same note, right, of third horn. Now our first has got to climb upwards. First a D, then an F sharp, helped a little bit here by the clarinets coming up from beneath, and reaching all the way up here to G sharp. Now you'll notice in the recording that the first player cracks the note slightly. Instead of assuring yourself that, oh, well, of course, that means that they're not a very good player, far from it. Those kinds of mistakes happen all the time, even with the most professional orchestra. Sometimes you just cannot trust your lip. But why would that high note crack? Well, the reason why is because it's really hard to play high notes very, very soft. Ravel has a moment like this at the beginning of Daphnis and Chloe, which is a work that I would really love to evaluate one of these days, but it's hugely long. It's a full hour's worth of music, but maybe down the road a ways. I have a few other things to look at first. But here we've got this high G sharp, very, very soft, and that is why it cracks, is because the player's really trying to control it. They're really trying to get their lip to speak right, and it just is not exactly happening at that moment. So I would say let that be a warning, right? Rather than any kind of statement about the abilities of the player. The player's abilities are fine. I really like her playing. However, right here, it's just a really tough thing to do, to play very high, also to have that tenuto articulation, right? Just a very full note all the way through, both times, and to play soft. And then here to play even softer, right? Più pianissimo, right? So just even more. So while all this is going on, by the way, this note is a sounding C sharp, right? That is forming harmony with our middle strings right in here. We've got D sharp and G natural, and then of course the C sharp above in first horn. And then here, this is a low F sharp played by the fourth horn in bass clef. And since this is old notation, that's actually going to be sounding up a perfect fourth on B. And that's the same B that you're seeing here, pizzicato in the cello, and then an octave lower, playing octaves with the fourth horn we've got our double bass. Now, here is a place where it's a fairly low note, and you would think, well, maybe that note should be doubled by the second horn, just to make it a little bit more solid. But sometimes low horns can really stand on their own, and here is a place where I would say, yeah, just see if that player can do it without any help, without any need to stabilize. Sometimes having an instrument playing an octave below is enough to stabilize the sound of the low horn. The very last thing you want is a very exposed low horn note that kind of quavers a bit, right? It sort of moves around a little bit because the player is really trying to control their lip and get it to come out really, really well. On the face of it, right here, we have two extremely difficult things in different ways for horn players to do, right? One is to play an exposed single note very, very low from a low player, and the other is to play a very soft note very, very high, also tenuto, for your first player. So those are two kind of excruciating demands, and yet a good player should be able to play those with no problem on a good day. But in this case, to be perfectly honest, this horn player has been playing a very demanding program, and just right when the lip absolutely needed to be steady, there was just a slight fluctuation, so you heard a little crack in the recording. So I don't want to harp on it too much and call too much attention to the problem that this presents, but it's just an example that can be used constructively in your own craft as an orchestrator, right? Of what demands you can make of certain players and what you can be assured of and what is more risky, right? So we've basically been talking about this cushion of harmony here and of the little punctuation, the bum, 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 bum. And this has a sense of syncopation here too, doesn't it? Right? We've got this sort of sense of 2 against 3. So 2 beats of rest, and then a pluck on the second beat. And that same thing is going on here with the low flutes right in here. And these low flutes are perfectly fine to score because everybody else is being so incredibly soft. This is a lovely touch right here. Very soft. This is going to be sounding F natural, right? The same note as the flutes right here. So what's going to happen is the English horn comes in here, joins in with this F natural, and then the flutes pull away up to G natural, right? And then there's just this little fluctuation right in here. D natural back to C, and so on. And while all that's going on, the harps are going back and forth in this very cool pattern. D sharp, G natural, F natural, C sharp, and just kind of going back and forth. And then here, double time, right? And then from below, a sort of reversal of the same pitch set from the second harp. This is also a wonderful touch in here. The left hand of the second harpist playing harmonics on that C sharp, so it will sound actually middle C sharp, then going to G natural and F, back and forth, F natural and G natural. While that's all happening, we have the further decoration of glockenspiel, hitting D sharp above, C sharp below, going back and forth between that ninth, kind of feeling a little random right in here with these F naturals and G naturals that we're seeing in other parts. And finally here, we come to the resolution. Now you probably noticed for this video that I used a painting of a moonlit night on the ocean, and that's really what I feel being channeled through the music here. The sense of release, right? It doesn't have to be moonlight. It could also just be during the daytime. But there's a sense of the energy of the waves finally letting go and becoming placid. And it's also interpreted as a musical release, right? Tension, then release, tension, then release, and then tension, and then the final release here. And we still have the motion of the waves expressed by different instruments, like a little bit of harp here, and our upward reaching triplet theme again. interpreted here as E Lydian. We've got that raised fourth, the A sharp. And as we saw before, there's a certain relationship in this movement and in this piece between Lydian and whole step melodies, right? Because we have 3 whole steps in a row, almost as if it were part of a whole tone scale. E to F sharp to G sharp to A sharp. But, of course, here's the leading tone of D sharp to E. So that's a half step. What's beautiful here is if the trumpet player really knows their business, as the Kaleidoscope trumpet player does, this will sound like low flutes. And that just is so beautiful. It's something that you wouldn't expect. And when you hear it for the first time, or maybe every time you hear it, you sort of feel that that is a low flute of some kind, maybe an alto flute or even just a first flute with a very, very fuzzy, breathy, lower range. And yet it really is just a muted trumpet. This probably sounds terrific on F trumpet, but even with today's B flat and C trumpets, it still sounds fantastic. And don't forget the wonderful cushioning chords right in here. We've got E below, an E fifth from cellos, and then yet another E fifth by our violas. And above that, we've got our C sharp and G sharp, and then same thing above, C sharp, G sharp, and C sharp above that. And it has the most magical sound. Then that comes back even softer all the way around throughout all the parts. And it's very simple too, isn't it? It's just repeating what happened before. And finally, the low strings are just holding on to this E octave in a fifth. Continuing on. Finally, just nothing but low double basses on what would be their lowest string for the standard double bass. Then over that, this lovely tracing of arpeggios. It's so evocative, little touches of cymbal. And now for actual low flutes, we have the final transformation of the upward reaching motive. This time not as sequential notes in a scale, but more as kind of a pentatonic, C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp. And at that point, the second comes in to play this note. And this is a really great way of doing it too, because this way the first can be as expressive as they like, and they can give up more breath on playing this in a lovely breathy way. And then the second can come in with a very nice controlled note that lasts quite a bit longer. And right on that downbeat, we have those last touches. B harmonic notes in first harp and Debussy first violins, soli. 6 of those, right? So it would be 3 on top and 3 on the bottom. This would probably be played just with a normally fingered B, and then this high B right here would be played with the finger position on the lower B plus a touch 4 harmonic over E. So it would sound 2 octaves higher. And just a little touch of glockenspiel, a touch of cymbal, twice. And then that's the beautiful, calm ending of this movement. So evocative. And yet, for all of that, even though you could put a heavy tone painting context onto this music, it still remains, in many senses, an Impressionist work. It's Debussy's impression. It's his emotional reaction to what he's seeing, rather than a blow-by-blow depiction of what's going on. It's his emotional reaction to what's going on. So, to some degree, that is tone painting. But what's even more important, and what makes this music so powerful and unforgettable, is that it's the emotions and the inner sense of the artist that is more important than putting the music blatantly into the service of just depicting one event after another. So let's have a listen to all of those features now. the beautiful way that this calmly comes to an end, the little touches of cymbal here and there, the little resonance that hangs in the air from these harmonics in the first violins, and the little tinging B harmonic in solo harp with a bit of icing above on glockenspiel. And how powerful this low solo flute is, and how individual and stirring it is, even by comparison with the wonderfully unique sound of the low solo muted trumpet right in here, which has a very similar sound in this context to the flute. Listen for how the harmony has this moment of uncertainty, all the while our sense of harmonic resolution has been deflected by Debussy throughout most of this movement, to where we mostly don't expect this to resolve in a simple 5 on the B to the 1 of E right in here, in this wonderful relaxation of all the tension that is coming before, even though the tension is quite calm in a way, isn't it? Here, the calmness gives way to a sense of emotional resolution that is, I feel, even more powerful than the blunt mechanics of going from 5 to 1. Listen for all of those elements, the charming interrelationship of the harps right in here with the glockenspiel, and the cushion of chords behind it, and a very forgiving and understanding ear, I feel, is necessary to usefully listen to the challenges that the horn players are going through right in this section. And don't neglect listening to all of the other elements of thematic texture here, these rising, slowly syncopated notes in the flute, and this little addition right here of English horn, which should be played very softly and subtly and mix in with the flutes above, and this bright little anticipation of things to come by the oboe. But starting here in your listening, see if you remember the role of the cellos as a foundational reference to what's going on in the harps above, and this almost warning note here on the clarinets. And of course, the somewhat nervous energy of the middle strings right in here, combined with a touch of danger from first horn on those stop notes. So listen for all of those things and more, even the things that I neglected to mention. And I will see you for the very exciting beginning of the third movement in our next lecture, coming next month here on Orchestration Online.